Hi, I'm Wyoming's Dr. Jackson Crawford. Runes get all the press because they were used for writing Old Norse earlier and because they look pretty cool and mysterious. But in fact, most of the texts that we have preserved for us today in Old Norse were written in the Roman alphabet, the same alphabet that we use for writing English today. But the alphabet was not used in exactly the same way in writing Old Norse and had to be adapted for writing Old Norse because, of course, that alphabet is designed originally for Latin. But Old Norse was not spoken or written in isolation. The earliest missionaries in Scandinavia would have come from England and from northern Germany, where languages closely related to Old Norse were spoken. Old English and early Middle English, as well as what we can call Old Saxon or Old Low German. These languages influenced the way that Old Norse was written in the Roman alphabet. For example, in the earliest texts that we have from Iceland, we have texts in the Roman alphabet from Iceland starting about 1150 AD. We see the letter thorn used to write both kinds of the TH sound. So both the TH sound, the interdental fricative, in breath, worth, or thin, and the voiced equivalent of that sound found in words like then, worthy, and breathe. For the first 75 years or so, roughly 1150 to 1225 in Iceland, that letter is used to write both, but the use of this letter in the Roman alphabet, even though the letter is ultimately a rune, comes from English practice. But in about 1225, we see that Iceland has switched to using thorn for just the voice sound, the sound in thin, worth, breath, and has borrowed another English letter, the letter called eth, which uses a early English form of the letter D, which has a curly back and a line through it, to write the voice sound of then, breathe, worthy, while thorn goes on to be used for thin, breath, worth, that sound. So there is change even in the Old Norse period about how things are spelled. But the way that the Latin alphabet is used is influenced by the way it is used for these neighboring languages like Old English. But then there are sounds that are not present in Latin or in Old English, and Old Norse had to come up with its own ways for writing them. One of these is the result of U-mutation of the vowel ah. This vowel would have sounded like a rounded ah, something like oh. It's like saying ah at the dentist's office but with your lips rounded, or like a northern New Jersey pronunciation of the O in coffee. This sound doesn't have a consistent way of being rendered in Latin, so you see a lot of different ways that it's rendered in medieval texts in Iceland and Norway. Sometimes you see O with a tail at the bottom, sometimes you see O with a tail at the top, sometimes you see O and an A written together as one letter, or A and U written together as one letter, or A and V written together as one letter, because U and V aren't consistently distinguished in medieval writing. In standardized Old Norse texts, we have to decide on one consistent way to render this if we're not trying to render the exact spelling of a manuscript. And the sort of standard textbook Old Norse way of rendering this is with an O with a tail at the bottom, and we call that O caudata. Although some people use O with diaeresis, 2 dots above it, which is the modern Icelandic spelling. So one thing that's very relevant about talking about how the Roman alphabet is adapted for writing Old Norse is that it is a major clue to telling us about the pronunciation of Old Norse in this period. Since the Church had a standard way of pronouncing Latin, whenever the Roman alphabet was adapted for writing a new language, we can assume that where the normal letters of Latin are used, the A, E, I, O, U vowels, the B, C, D, F, G consonants, probably these consonants are being used in a way that's at least similar to the way they were pronounced in medieval Latin. We also have the additional clue that since it was probably mostly English and Northern German missionaries writing the Old Norse, that if they had a modified way of writing their own language in the Roman alphabet, that probably got transmitted to Old Norse. So, for instance, we usually assume that the vowels of Old Norse probably had the same vowels as they had in Latin. A, E, I, O, U probably sounded like A, E, I, O, U, much as they did in medieval Latin or medieval English or German. But an example of English influence would be in the writing of the V sound in the middle of words. This is written in early English as an F, and we see the same thing in Old Norse, although the modern Scandinavian languages like Norwegian and Swedish now write that with a V. So the adaptations of one alphabet to another are an interesting feature of the history of Old Norse as well as many other languages of Europe, and the study of this is not yet done, because we'll never exactly know all the details of who decided what and what exact letters represented what exact sounds, although linguists can make pretty good guesses. This is a video that was requested for one of my Patreon supporters, Matthew Menard, so hi to Matthew. And to everyone else watching, all the best to you from wild, wonderful Wyoming.